welcome back, faithful politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by Josh Bertram, your faithful host. How's it going, Josh?
Hey, Will. Doing fine.
Hey, good. And this week we have with us Diana Florence. She is a 25-year veteran of the Manhattan DA office, where the current district attorney, Alvin Bragg, resides and recently indicted former President Trump over a series of falsified records. Florence is also one of the most experienced prosecutors that ran against Bragg in the election for that DA seat. And today we're going to be speaking with her about what all of this means. And I frankly couldn't think of a better person to have on the show to really kind of break all this down. So thanks for being on the show,
Thank
Diana.
you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, so let's just kind of jump right into it and start first with maybe a little bit of your background in the Manhattan office, and if you so desire to talk about your campaign for that seat, like why did you want to do it, and how that all turn out. I think we know, but I'd love to.
Yeah, spoiler alert, I lost, but no, I'm happy to. Let me give you just a brief biographical sketch. So I'm a New Yorker. And I grew up in New York, and as a kid, when I was really little, I have a very sick brother who's autistic and has a lot of other issues. And my parents, in trying to figure that out, left me a lot with babysitters, and I was left in front of the television. And I'm a kid of the 70s, and so because they were trying to be, virtuous, I watched PBS. So I watched, Sesame Street Electric Company and then the Watergate hearings. And for me, Ernie and Bert and the hearings kind of all went hand in hand. And so my parents very early on figured I'd probably end up being a lawyer. For a while, I took a detour. I was a singer. I went to the University of North Carolina on a music scholarship, which, awesome. Thank you, go Tar Heels. And we went down there, loved it, but promptly figured out I wasn't going to be the next Madonna, and kind of leaned into my, there's a performance aspect of being a trial lawyer. And so I kind of got that creative side out through being a trial lawyer, and then found myself wanting to be a prosecutor because my third year of law school, I stayed for law school at UNC as well. And I worked in the defense clinic. And I'd spent my junior year in Spain, and so I spoke fluent Spanish. And back in the mid-'90s, they didn't provide interpreters, and there were a lot of migrant workers. Chapel Hill is a very sort of cosmopolitan college town, but just 10 minutes outside, there's chicken plants and farms, and there's a lot of need for migrant workers, and they were disproportionately arrested for DWI and shoplifting and things like that. And I had a huge caseload. Because I had the Spanish, I basically had more cases than anybody. In doing that job as a defense attorney, ironically, it made me want to be a prosecutor. I always knew I'd come back to New York. And the reason I sort of went that direction was because I saw that no matter how brilliant an art, a case I found, or my wonderful arguments, that at the end of the day, the prosecutor is the one who had the power. And if I wanted to really, be able to change things, I had to do it from within. So went to the Manhattan DA's office in 1995, spent 5 years doing domestic violence cases, which, were my, passion. And it was incredible experience, and was able to kind of always be a little creative. I did the first case without a victim, and, where they had to testify. But then in 2000, I switched over to the white collar division. I was pregnant in 2001, had my daughter in 2001, and then when I came back from maternity leave, was greeted with a mountain of 9/11 fraud cases, people that made up family members to sort of take advantage of the amount of charity, hundreds of thousands of dollars in aid. So I sort of made my name, even though I loved those domestic violence cases. My name sort of started because I was good at kind of putting paper together, sort of saying, to me, it's like almost if an artist works, in tiles for a mosaic or paints. For me, my medium was evidence and paper. And creating sort of the cases so that you could understand the storyline. So I went from domestic violence to, paper cases just in general. And then in 2008, switched over to construction and fraud and safety, did one of the largest cases, stumbled onto one of the largest cases involving the falsification of the concrete strength at the World Trade Center Yankee Stadium. It was a massive racketeering case involving much of this industry, went after CEOs. From that, created a task force focused on construction fraud and safety that brought together public and private sector. Was really successful, loved that, but then sort of thought at my 20-year mark, I'm a government girl. I wanted to, now cash in, have got my pension. And then someone named Carlos Moncayo, a 22-year-old undocumented immigrant, went to work one morning in the meatpacking district. And then by noon, he was buried alive because of the construction shortcuts that they took. And that case, drew me back in like Michael Corleone. And I stayed for another 5 years working on basically that case was ultimately a homicide conviction that I brought, not just against the media company, but the developer. And it spawned this task force that had already existed because of the concrete case, but it just created this whole new way of looking at prosecution, using the law to do things other than just simply do what's in front of you, but be proactive. And it leads into why I ran. Ultimately those 5 years of leaving my desk and going to worker centers and community board meetings and wherever people were, I ended up getting some amazing cases, doing major cases in wage theft and things like that. I learned, leaving your office, you get to meet a lot of people. I ended up, becoming a known in the community. I became known in union circles. And, at the same time, my former boss, Vance, was sort of falling in popularity. The Me Too movement had happened. And, people started saying to me, maybe you should think about running. And so for me, the culmination of all the work that I did, I was never even I didn't run for student council. I wasn't even one of those people. Yes, I was a performer. But, sort of wrap it up and just say, that's ultimately why I ran. But of course, I'll just say, although I finished right smack in the middle of the 9 candidates, I raised the least amount of money because I don't, I'm very fortunate, but I'm not a millionaire. And so, it's, your friends start to block you because you keep asking them for money. Unfortunately, politics is money. And maybe we can do another podcast on that. But
politics is money, yes.
but here I am. And, there's other aspects of the campaign, but I know we're not here really to talk about me. So, happy to move on from there.
That's awesome. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. And yeah, I think a discussion about money in politics and campaigns would be definitely something we would be interested in, especially given everything that we're seeing in the news recently, specifically about Clarence Thomas and everything. But anyways, so in your time in the Manhattan office, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you if you ever crossed paths with Matt Murdock or Jennifer Walters.
No, unfortunately, but I hear they do good work, and that when sometimes I hear that when you have one sentence that is minimized, you can really hone in on things. So it's a goal of mine someday.
Yeah. So I'm a big Marvel fan. So for the audience wondering who the heck are these two, Matt Murdock is Daredevil and Jennifer Walters is awesome. She-Hulk. I believe they both work out of Hell's Kitchen. But anyways, so okay, Trump case. So tell us. Maybe briefly, tell us what this case is about, and where does it fit kind of in the, panoply of districts, boroughs, etc. We hear, about New York. I mean, I couldn't even tell you what a borough is. I think New York's the only place that I've ever heard that term used. So maybe kind of just give us, the Reader's Digest version of what this case is and why is it at the Manhattan office?
No. So it is, New York can be both, totally accessible and basically Mars. One of the reasons I love it.
Yes.
So borough is just literally a fancy kind of synonym for county. So New York City is made up of 5 boroughs, 5 counties, right? So Manhattan is the jewel. I mean, and the other ones might say otherwise, but let's be honest. When you think of New York City, you think of Manhattan. Brooklyn's its own thing, right? So Manhattan is New York County, Brooklyn is Kings County, Queens is Queens County, Staten Island is Richmond County. So I think those are the five. I think I got all five there. So and that's what it is in essence. So it's no different than any other place in the U.S. Right? Every county in every state has their own district attorney, and that's what the Manhattan DA's office is. Oh, my audio just cut out. Okay, were you able to hear me?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, no, it's
okay,
good.
Perfect. Yeah. So I worked in the Manhattan DA's office, and so if you think about, I'll just use, since I'm a Tar Heel, Fred, right? I mean, in Chapel Hill was in Orange County, right? So we did cases, whether they were in Chapel Hill or Hillsborough, different parts of the county. But you do, and what does the prosecutor do? They're responsible for enforcing the state criminal laws. So that could be a shoplift, that could be a murder, but it also can be an embezzlement, right? It can be anything that is covered in the state laws. So even though, Orange County in North Carolina has both suburban and sort of rural, in Manhattan, obviously, we're just city, we're just urban, right? So, so there's going to be less tractor thefts in North Carolina, than in New York than in North Carolina. Maybe, hopefully, you never know. But in any event, so the Manhattan DA's office is that, but so they are just a county office. But in fact, because Manhattan is we think the center of the universe, but even if you don't, it's certainly the kind of cross section of politics, business, entertainment. I mean, everything is there. So. Everything, the cases that we do, and I still say we, because even though I've been gone for 3 years, but the cases that we do are very much, they're going to be on steroids than something that a regular local prosecutor. So my boss, when I moved to New York back from North Carolina in 1995, was the legendary Robert Morgenthau, who was his father was in the Roosevelt cabinet. He's one of these largers in life. He grew up with the Kennedys and things like that. And he was, he's sort of immortalized on television. His alter ego would be Adam Schiff from Law and Order. And, it's somewhat, it was a little bit of creative license, but he was an incredible person, and he was almost apolitical in when you worked for him. Reason I'm mentioning that here with Trump is that you have to understand the roots of this office, that yes, generally speaking, we're a local office. And as I said in my opening, I did domestic violence cases, I did shoplifting, I did all the regular stuff. But, because Morgenthau, had previously been he had been the federal prosecutor in New York under Lyndon Johnson and Kennedy. In fact, he had to, Nixon had to almost remove him from the office.
Wow.
He had created this idea that, just because we're state doesn't mean we can't do the complicated cases that our guys down the street are. And in fact, we're going to do them even better because, sometimes the state laws have a little bit of a, benefit that they can be less complex, if you will. So all of that is to say, that is sort of the origin story, if you will, in our superhero theme of why the Manhattan DA's office, has been historically very uniquely suited to do the complex cases and the racketeering cases and bringing it down BCCI, big banks, and again. So the Trump case in and of itself is not unusual for the district attorney's office to tackle, or a Trump investigation. Any business that is situated within our borders. But remember, we're Manhattan, so everything passes through us. So we can get jurisdiction on lots. But in Trump, it's super easy, right? They're on. I forgot if they're on Fifth Avenue now or they're downtown, but it doesn't matter. They're on the island of Manhattan. So that's the jurisdiction of how Trump could in fact be investigated and why it's, completely not a crazy thing that a local prosecutor is doing this. So I'll pause because I might have lost the thread of what you're looking for. So tell me where you want to point me.
Yeah. So point us to, thank you for the summary of Manhattan and everything, because, it's one of those things where like I couldn't name a district attorney for any other state.
Right.
Like with the exception of New York. And so you did a really good job explaining kind of why Manhattan is sort of like the center in which all other, judicial gravity, floats around or what have you. But maybe kind of break down what, the indictment is, kind of big picture, and then we'll ask you some questions that are kind of split the onions, but the baby. I'm not sure what term I'm trying to use here. Split something. We'll ask you more details
Perfect.
about it.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about the indictment. So the indictment is a 34 count listing, if you will, of various falsifying business records counts. Every count is an felony. So in New York, as in every state, a felony is the most serious type of crime. That just means it's punishable by more than 1 year. Misdemeanors are less serious. They're usually punishable by, 1 year or less. And then violations are criminal-ish, but they're not, you don't have a criminal record. So those are the three categories of crimes. New York is different than many states these days in that what we're, even though we think we're cool and hip and on the latest trend, we're old school when it comes to law. We use the grand jury system. The grand jury relates back, to Old England, common law. The idea behind the grand jury is if you're going to charge someone with the most serious type of crime, you don't want to have some rogue prosecutor just be able to type something up at their their desk. You want a group of citizens to hear the evidence and make sure that they think there's enough. Not that they're guilty or not guilty, but is there enough to basically make have a public hearing, ultimately a trial that will result in conviction. So we use a grand jury system, and that is so the indictment itself is the result of a presentation to 23, between 16 and 23 people. The maximum is 23, and 12 of those people had to vote that there was probable cause. And it's not unlike the federal system, which also has grand juries. Federal system is so easy. You throw your agent in and you say, tell me about Mr. Trump and the evidence here. And then they just talk and talk and talk. And then when they're done, the prosecutor says, hey, grand jury, what do you think? Yes or no. And then they vote yes or no. In the state system, much harder because you have to call witnesses. There's no hearsay. So if you're going to assert something, you either have to have, a document, piece of proof, video, whatever, or a witness that is going to testify. So what a grand jury does, and I hope I'm not going too in the weeds, but I just want you to know how this came about.
Nope.
Okay.
No,
so what we've been reading about when, you have the reporters camped out saying, I spied Michael Cohen or whoever, or David Pecker. What's happening is each time the grand jury met, those individuals were sworn under oath and they testified before these, up to 23 people. It's like a trial in that way. You ask questions as a prosecutor and the witness answers, and they have to answer truthfully. But it's not like a trial in that there's no judge and there's no defense attorney. What happens when the prosecutor is finished asking the questions in the grand jury is it almost reverts to like the Oprah Winfrey show. Remember after Oprah would go into the audience with the microphone and, audience members would raise their hand and they'd have a question? Same thing, except you don't just get to like ask it. It's filtered through the Oprah, the prosecutor in this. and the questions, frankly, are, they're
right.
fantastic usually. And it's funny because there's a adage that gets batted around a lot, which is you can grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. And that was actually said by a disgraced former chief judge of New York who basically was a pedophile. And I get so angry every time I hear that expression because yes, the standard is much lower. It's reasonable cause, a probable cause, but it is not nothing to do a grand jury presentation. And when the grand jurors ask questions, they often ask the best questions because they're not like you, the prosecutor, who's so mired in the case. So in any event, after the questions are done and all the evidence is done, the prosecutor then just asks the grand jury, okay, you've heard all the evidence. Here are the charges I believe, that are legally supported by the evidence. And then they vote again in secret whether they can say yes, grand jury action, a true bill, or no, the case is over and it should be secret because it never should have been public to begin with, even though here it certainly was. Or a third option is we are not sure. We don't have enough for either one and bring us more evidence. So that's the grand jury process. So now I know I've gotten I'm going to take my detour back to help you with Trump. 34 counts. Sounds like a lot. It isn't really, it's not really a lot though. It's actually, it's fair given what this charge is. And we can talk about whether the charges should have been brought, but that's another story. If you're going to charge a, a theory based on hush payment money, falsifying business records and its cousin, offering a false instrument for filing, which is just the public version. If you filed a false statement with the buildings department as opposed to your own business, those things, those crimes happen in a moment. So if I write down in my business records right now, and not everyone will see me, but I have blonde hair. If I write in my business records, I love my purple hair. That's a lie. No purple hair, right? But at that moment, as soon as I've written it, it's done. It can't be like if I keep writing it every single day, each one of those instances is a new crime. It's not a continuing, I have purple hair, I have a purple hair, I have purple hair, I have purple hair, right? So it's just, whereas if I were to steal, let's say I'll just do a quick other, so when you have a continuing crime, that is, let's say, Will, I somehow snuck into the studio and I stole your ATM card, and for the next 6 months, I stole $200 from your bank account, right? So each one of those could be a larceny, a pettit larceny, because it's under $1,000, right? But the minute I hit over $1,000, I can add those all up together and have one felony, one grand larceny. So if I were indicting me for stealing your money, I could do 6 counts of $200, but I could also do one continuing crime of $1,200 as a grand larceny. So it would be a felony and 6 misdemeanors. But you can't do that with documents.
So, gotcha. So they basically.
I was going to say just real fast. If you broke into the studio and stole my ATM and stole $200, you probably mistakenly grabbed my wife's ATM.
I'm really in trouble.
I just want to make that clear. Go ahead.
It's funny because I'm trying to understand all this, right? Because when it's the public image, right, put forward, everything is like, Trump is getting basically indicted because he paid off a porn star, right? That's the kind of things, but that's not what it's going to say in the legal documents, right? But we hear something and we make all the assumptions, but it's very different the way everything goes and the way things proceed with all the procedural considerations and the things you have to do. My question is, when it comes to this, when it comes to these indictments, how much could they actually, what could this actually do to Trump? Is it serious enough that he could go to jail? Is it serious enough that he could lose? How long would he go to jail? If it gets dropped to a misdemeanor or something, does that affect, and this is not getting political, it's merely procedural. Does that affect his ability to run for office? What's going on with this? How serious is this really?
Well, let me just start with the overarching thing. Whether you're charged with a misdemeanor or a felony, that's really serious. I mean, having a criminal record in this country.
Totally. Yeah,
whether
absolutely.
You are, the former president or, working people like us, having a criminal record is awful. And going through the criminal process is a low point in anyone's life. So it's deadly serious, of course. And it's even more serious with a felony. Remember, the distinction between a felony is it's about jail time, right? You can get more jail, more prison for a felony than a misdemeanor. So just start with that just basic premise. I want to go back though to the first thing you said, that, it's about, this is about him paying, hush money to a porn star. What's funny that has struck me is that.
So that's the public idea, right? I know that's
no, but here's, I know you do, but this is the thing, right? it's fine to pay hush money that's not a crime at all. The reason this is a crime here.
Well, that's good to know, Will. You better write that down.
I'm happy to, give you all sorts of things not a crime that, or maybe appalling, but not a crime.
So when we're off this call and it's not being recorded, I have a few questions I'd like to ask you just off the record.
Stop.
I
Just
think
stop.
The conversation is going to be a gas, Josh.
Hey, you know what? I've told this congregation some pretty crazy stuff and they still love me. So I don't know.
No, but
anyway, I deny any rumors that come out of this are not true because I'm kidding.
No, but the funny thing, in all seriousness, it's fine to pay hush money. The reason that we're all, we've all met, like our paths would never have crossed probably, if in fact, the former president hadn't used his company to basically reimburse. So if he just used his own funds, it'd be fine.
It's just like giving someone money. Like if it's over a certain amount, they have to pay taxes, but it's just giving them money. You can give people whatever you want.
Absolutely. So the reason we're here, and then again, believe it or not, we're looping back to the indictment, and then I can go to your questions about the severity of it.
No, this is great. Right? This is awesome.
The reality is the reason we're here is because of the manner in which these payments were made, and there was a side benefit. So the best way I can sort of kind of put this in, I think, regular terms is I have a American Airlines credit card. I fly back and forth to North Carolina. My daughter's a junior there. As I said, I'm a big Tar Heel. My husband's Tar Heel. So I love that card because every time I go to the grocery store, I get miles, right? So I get, I need milk, but I also, get miles. So I get two things, a twofer. What Trump effectively is being charged with here is kind of getting a twofer, which is he's getting, yes, the most important, right, is he didn't want this stuff to come out because it's embarrassing and maybe could have tanked his election. But the company was also getting a write-off because by calling the payments legal expenses, that's deductible, right? So that's the sort of most simple thing. This is just a twofer, if you will, and the twofer is what has landed him in this scenario, putting aside the election stuff and all the salacious and it. By the way, it doesn't matter if she were a porn star or the leader of your choir at your church, Josh. It's if you can pay whoever you want, right? It's not about Stormy Daniels' character. Again, that's why this case, as much as whether you're a MAGA person or you are the most woke progressive person, at the end of the day, we're all subject to this law of right. You have to tell the truth on your business records, and if you don't, you could be subject to it. So anyway, what I can also say, just sort of as out of the gate, is that are we all, we're all not perfect, right? So are we all going to be held accountable for every, bad thing that we ever do? No. And no prosecutor could do that. The problem here for Trump is that once a prosecutor starts investigating, and having done this for, so many years, and Will, I'll say to you, I was the most experienced person in that race. Experience doesn't matter though.
I know.
So it's fine. It's just my little twist, but I only mention that here is because when you've done this a long time, that it's never good for a prosecutor to get a hold of your records, whether it's your bank records, your business records, and especially, again, my bias right up front. I did a lot of work in the construction and real estate industry, and a lot of corners are cut. So often, and I think I talked about this with you on the phone, Will, if I get a complaint that's reasonable, that gives me a basis to start investigating, and I get those records, when I start looking, I may be looking at whatever, something A, but then I might find B, C, and D and decide that A wasn't really even that great an angle, but I'm going to go with B, C, and D. And that's what I can, I don't know because I wasn't part of the Trump team, but that's what I can surmise might have happened here. So that's part of the reason too, is that, it's not necessarily, you can debate if you're unfair or fair where you're on the political spectrum, but the reality is it's just a truism that when prosecutors start looking, unless you are, the purest of the pure, they're probably going to find something.
Yeah. Can you explain, at least some of the reporting was that the SDNY initially had asked the DA's office to take a pause on it. And
Will, can you define SDNY for Will or Diana?
Yeah, sure.
yeah.
For people who are outside of New York?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so remember, so we'll go back to our civics lesson, right? So every county in the U.S. has a prosecutor, a local prosecutor that's in charge of local laws.
Mhm.
And then states, there's a federal judicial system, and states are divided into different districts. So New York, because we're big and populous, there's 4, north, south, east, west. And the Southern District,
Gotcha.
which is the most powerful.
Which includes New York
It
City,
includes
of course.
some of the boroughs, right? If we're going to get, so it includes Manhattan and
Yes.
Bronx, and the Eastern District includes Brooklyn,
Gotcha.
Long Island, and Queens. So now you know you're going to be able to come and practice law.
Eastern District.
So
Yeah, and the SDNY is famous because it seems like, I mean, you've got like Preet Bharara, Robert Mueller, like all these, like Andy McCarthy.
Major like key figures that have been there and done.
yes,
Yeah.
and my former boss, Robert M. Morgenthau, was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. And again, remember my history lesson. The reason that the Manhattan DA's office is frankly what it is, doing the complex work, is he was like, there's no reason I have to stop doing this just because I'm now an elected state prosecutor. And so, to your point, right? Look, my former boss, Vance, went on the TV shows saying that they were asked to stand down. That surprises me because Morgenthau famously would basically thumb his nose at that. So I can't say whether it happened or not, but that certainly is not a bar. And again, there's a very famous case, BCCI, which involved banking fraud that was very much a kind of turf war. And just to add to the turf war, and maybe to your like the Marvel-esque kind of stuff here, we're at 100 Center Street, and they're two buildings away is the Southern District. So it's at 40 Center Street is the federal courthouse. So this is literally it's like Duke and Carolina, just down. It's a rivalry.
Yeah. So regardless if the SDNY asked, for the DA's office to stand down, I mean, like it would seem that there was some standing down because this case, I mean, a lot of the things in the indictment happened 2016, 2017, what have you, and there does seem to be this long period of time, which leads me and I know others to think like are there statutes of limitations for these types of charges? Is there like a one commentary I've heard discuss like equitable tolling? I think that's the word, equitable, regarding like when does sort of the clock stop and start. So can you maybe talk about
that? This is another example of Trump being his own worst enemy. First, we have, if he just paid the hush money out of his own money, he'd be fine. And the second thing is, I believe it was in September of 2019, in order to thumb his nose at New York for being liberal and bad, he said, forget this, I'm a Florida guy now, right? But by doing that, he stopped the clock. There's a section of the statute of limitations. It's in New York, but it's in other states too, that if you're continuously outside the state, doesn't matter if we know exactly where you are, right? You get to stop the clock, not indefinitely. It's basically stopped for 5 years. So 2024, he would have been fine. But by, stopping that clock in 2019, they had more time to do this. So just to sort of circle back to your dates, if these things happened in 2016 and 2017, and I think from looking at the indictment, it's not about when payments were made to Stormy. It's about when the reimbursements were happening, because that's when the entries in the business records are made. That's when the clock starts ticking. So 2017 plus 5 is 2022. So, but for him changing his residency from New York to Florida, again, we never would have met. So thank you, Mr. Trump, because I'm having a great time today.
Wow, that's so the fact that the charges are brought is a function of an action that Trump did. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly.
Well, no, I mean, what I'm saying is you can do all the criminal activity you want. If nobody finds out about it and the last bit of criminal activity you did was 5 years ago yesterday, you're good, right? What I'm saying is that, Mr. Trump here, and again, this has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in court. So he's, right now he's charged, right? But the charges could not be brought at this time. Could have been brought last year in 2022, but not in 2023 if he hadn't, sort of been too clever by half in changing his residence.
Got it. Okay. And something you said earlier, I wanna get back to where these charges are felonies, but would they normally be misdemeanors? And if so, like how, what's the conversion? Like what's sort of the catalyst to make them into felonies?
Okay. So falsifying business records in the second degree is a misdemeanor. And that's when you just, you put lies. So again, my example of the purple hair, right? When I gave that example of myself, that's a misdemeanor in my business records. But if I, put that, if I put that down, that I have purple hair for the purpose of obtaining an American Express card in Josh's name, let's say, and Josh is, that's part of the thing on his profile, so where you can get it, right? That's another crime, right? That's a secondary crime. And now that stupid, lie that's a, less serious becomes more serious. Now, I'm using a silly example. I'll use a more concrete one, no pun intended, from one of my cases, right? I mentioned in passing, the Testwell case, which is the company that falsified the concrete strength at the World Trade Center and other major New York City landmarks, Yankee Stadium, Second Avenue Subway, you bet. And what they did was they had actually tests made up that said the concrete is 12,000 psi, but it really was 7,500. And they did that as part of a scheme to extract money from their clients, right, for tests that were not run. So that was the reason that those reports, those were both falsifying business records because they were their own records, and they went also to other, to their clients' businesses. But they also were offering a false instrument for filing because they were filing them with the Port Authority, who owns the World Trade Center. So does that make sense? I just want to make sure you understand the kind of, okay.
It does,
okay,
yeah.
So
yeah.
Here, now let's go to Trump.
Right.
So yes, this is sort of a no-brainer, right? It's clearly not legal expenses. I don't think there's any dispute that, this was legal expenses. It's hush money, right? So this is legal expenses every time they book that. And that's why there's 34 counts, right? Every time they wrote that in connection with an invoice and a check, that's why there's a count. And so that's why the 34 counts are there. But where that secondary crime is, that's where it gets interesting because, before the indictment was unsealed, there's all this discussion. It's this election fraud idea. And as we all remember, about a decade ago, John Edwards was tried on a federal election fraud idea with campaign contributions, and he was acquitted, right? It was a kind of an embarrassment. So that's a very tough charge. And I always had my doubts about that. But then there is this obscure state statute that also kind of references you can't conspire to undermine an election. And that's a misdemeanor. It's sort of a unclassified misdemeanor, which I won't get into that boring details. But the point is, it's a misdemeanor. That could be the other crime. But it is the most convoluted idea. I on another talk show, I talked about it. It's like to use that state crime to refer back to a federal crime. It is like you saying to me, I'm in New York, how do I get to LA? And I say to you, okay, well, fly to London and then connect through Paris and then get another flight back to New York and then go to LA, right? As opposed to just, we're New York, yeah. We have an awesome airport, go directly to LA, right? That's much easier. And so to me, what I've been talking about, from the start is it's tax. Tax is boring, I know, but we all know Al Capone. But the end of the day, The election stuff, not irrelevant. It gives motive, right? It's the reason that they did it this way. And but to me, the underlying crime here is tax fraud. And one of the issues I have with the case as it is right now is the DA's office is not quite being fair by not just saying that outright. I do wonder why that is. So we can talk more about that, but I'm going to pause and let you jump in.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's so fascinating. All this stuff comes together and it gets so convoluted, but it's amazing to see kind of the inner workings of all of it. And, obviously, I think Trump, with his army of lawyers or whatever, they're looking at this and they're trying to figure out how they can come up with a defense or whatever it is. Here's my question. And it's kind of like, you can take it however you want it. Go with it, whatever direction you feel is the best. Trump gets indicted. He gets charged. He goes to trial. How good do you... Well, I don't know how you can answer this. I don't want you to say anything. Obviously, you don't want to say anything you can't say. Essentially, how strong is the case? And how likely is it, do you find, that he'll be actually convicted? What would his defense, what defense might they come up with this? Like, it wasn't him, it was someone else, or what? I don't, what would be, how might he get off of this? He seems like, and again, you don't have to be political, but I can. This is a show about being political, right? And religious. Like, he seems to always be able to say whatever he wants, kind of do whatever he wants, and nothing sticks. And some people are like, some of his avid supporters, which I voted for him in 2016, didn't in 2020. I've said that 100 times. I have my own reasons. I've explained it on the podcast, so it's not like it's like, but people, a lot of my friends, I asked that guy the other day, you think it'll stick? He's like, no way. They're just trying to, it's a witch hunt. They're just trying. So this is what the public thinks. They have no idea what, what do you think's really going on here?
So again, and I'll say, yeah, I'm a Democrat, right? So I definitely did not vote for Trump. I held my nose and voted for Hillary Clinton. I've never loved Hillary Clinton either, but I'm definitely a Democrat. So I'm not a pro-Trump. I'm not against Trump, but he would certainly not be, who I would select for president. That being said, I find myself in this very strange position because I do think it is very difficult, whether you're Donald Trump or Donald Smith, to be able to formulate a defense if you do not know specifically what the underlying charge is. And that's why it's been a cottage industry of pundits like me, right, going on talk shows and podcasts and speculating about which it is. I'm doing it based on my experience. Other people are doing it based on, the aura or what they think, or I don't know. There's a million stories and they consider there's a million theories of what the underlying crime is. And it's interesting that it hasn't changed since the indictment has been unsealed. And that's where, frankly, it's not about the strength of the case. I think what disappoints me is that there's the jig is up at this point. Once the indictment is unsealed, all the secrecy, the shrouds of those things, it's totally fair game before it's unsealed. But once it isn't, you have to commit to a theory. And by the way, they're going to have to. It's not going to just continue on like this, which is why to me, it's a bit disappointing that the DA's office didn't just say what it is. Now, let me take a step back. The reason that I can't say for sure that it's what tax fraud it is, right? I'm speculating it's the to deduct legal expenses. Now, maybe because there's no tax fraud count, maybe they never filed their tax returns. There's been other speculation that, Michael Cohen on his tax returns reported this as income, when that's not true, because a lot of it was just reimbursement, right? So reimbursement is not the same as income. And so if he overpaid taxes, that's a hard sell, right? You're paying too much to the government, put me in jail. What that said, no one ever, right? But this is the thing, and I think actually, I don't know if I'm going to jump the gun with one of your questions. The thing that people aren't talking about is conspiracy to commit tax fraud. And one thing I think I've seen bandied around, I think you even might have asked me this as well, is why isn't there a conspiracy charge? And I'm going to tell you now. You're going to be the least exciting answer, but I'll tell you why. Yeah, I wish I had more like nuggets. But I don't. But conspiracy.
Yeah, I wish there was like a conspiracy, and it was like something like Mission Impossible, where they had to go get something from Trump's like secret underground base, and they had to sneak in there, and it was something that was gonna. And there's something about George Soros in there. That's his name, right? And then
like a talking dog, maybe. I don't know, but no, none of that. That's
lizard person. All right.
Yeah, no. So conspiracy law. Whew. Now you guys are all going to turn to your next podcast. But in New York, the charge of conspiracy is a huge pain in the neck because it requires you to do what's called a speaking indictment, which is you have to put all the facts into the indictment. If you guys might know that the indictment here is very underwhelming. It's just a listing of charges with just legal, language. That's completely okay and normal, and that is run of the mill, and it's what I did all the time. You don't put all the details, the evidence in the indictment, but there are certain charges in New York that make you do that. One is conspiracy and one is racketeering. Racketeering, way better. We can do another podcast on a lot of, I have much fun I had using racketeering cases, right? But you can write, and in corporate environments, not with mafia, that's less fun. But racketeering, that you have to, and it's part of the statute. Conspiracy, it's part of the statute. But the difference between racketeering and conspiracy is racketeering gets you to elevate these low-level E felonies that we're talking about, document crimes, to a B felony, which is major jail, major imprisonment. That's what, in the concrete cases, that's what we did. And it was right, because frankly, it wasn't just paper. It wasn't just, who cares if the concrete is 12,000 or 7,000. This is like a major, fraud on the public. And there are times when you do it sparingly. Okay, so conspiracy. It's like the opposite. It's like a joy suck, because what happens with conspiracy is you do all this work, you write all these facts in the indictment, and it's a less serious. It's one level less serious than the conspiracy you're entering into. So what that means is, if it's conspiracy to falsify documents in the first degree, the conspiracy would be a misdemeanor. So you do all that work and you have basically I have purple hair charge. Like, who wants it, right? Who does that? Not me either, right? So, but here's the sort of, kind of kicker, is that the underlying charge of the falsifying business records can be a conspiracy to commit tax fraud. So it can be a misdemeanor. So to me, going back to my thing about fairness, that's probably the best way to go here. Not the election fraud, because the federal thing, and we already talked about John Edwards, really hard charge to prove. The state one, because you don't want to go to LA through London. And here we are, you pick the underlying charge, the underlying theory that you have the best chance of. That's how I would approach it. And so if, again, when you asked me, Josh, if it's a good case or a bad case, well, annoying lawyer, it depends. Yeah. But for me, I mean, I would make it
Makes
a
sense.
good case, and I would pick the charge that's the easiest to prove. And to me, there's no question that this was a twofer. He wanted to pay off Stormy Daniels and maybe also get a deduction too.
That's so wild.
There you
go. so here's the I don't know, the $7,000 question. Because I'm sure that people have asked you, okay, if you had been elected, would you bring this case? And I respect the fact that that you've made it known that we don't know enough, or you don't know enough to really make a an assessment or a judgment on that, which totally respect. I think there's been a lot of sort of like I don't know, legal analysis, pontifications on stuff that we just don't know. So I'm going to phrase this question a little bit differently. If you had all the evidence you needed to bring a strong case, so in your mind, we can remove, former President Donald Trump, it's Donald Smith. You have everything you need to bring the case. You're ready. Like, how much consideration would you give to the fact that this is a former president and it would just be like a media circus after you do it?
I mean, one of the principles that I, rested my career on is that nobody is above the law. So to me, and then everyone also has to be treated fairly under the law. So it doesn't matter if you are, a high profile person or someone who literally lives in a homeless shelter. You need to be treated fairly. And also on the flip side, victims need to be able to be listened to. So, it shouldn't be that because the person that victimized them is powerful that they don't get justice. So to me, that's always been my guiding principles, is trying to weigh it all. As a kid, I loved the show Quantum Leap, and it's back, right? And
oh, I do too.
Yes,
Yeah, Scott
still love it. And one of the sort of defining things about that show was putting right where what once went wrong, and that's what the law really should be. That's that's sort of how I approached it. And unfortunately, I didn't have a time machine, but the best way that you can do that is using the facts in front of you and then bringing the cases appropriately. And to me, if it's the former president or someone, a Harvey Weinstein or whoever, or the CEO of a major, construction company, you have to, the additional things you weigh is, if I am unsuccessful, am I going to set back, justice? Because you do have to think about what are the repercussions of winning and losing. So in, an example of a big wage theft case, I did a $6 million wage theft case. And this company had stolen all this money from their various workers, some of them undocumented. And it was really important that this case be publicized, not to ostracize the owners that had done this, but once we won, because it needed to have a public policy idea that it is not okay whether the person's family can go back to the Mayflower or they just got here. If they work honestly for you, you have to pay them. And that's, to me, the power of criminal law, and why sometimes it's important to do publicity with cases. So now to circle back to Trump, correct. I don't know what the evidence is. I know that I would certainly approach this case as any other, with understanding that there would be a public element to it. And if you're going to bring a case, it needs to there needs to be good that comes out of it, not just beyond the four corners of whether Trump goes to prison. I realize I never answered that question for you, Josh, and I can, or not. It's about whether or not, what is the ultimate legacy of the case.
That's so wild. Yeah. So a case of this magnitude, like, would it be fair to say that the development and the strength of the case would not differ or should not differ any more or less because he is a former president?
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, I think we also do live in the real world, right? We do know that no one's ever had an arraignment like that. And so the analysis should be whether, that it's Donald Smith, would we bring this case, right? Then in terms of, the fact that it is not Donald Smith, it is Donald Trump, how can we do this? How can we bend over backwards to make sure we're being fair and we are, doing everything, not giving him, deference, but not giving him, not over criminalizing him either. It's a balancing act, and it's not easy. I mean, many of my friends and, supporters, everyone comes out of the woodwork and things like that. And they say, oh, we're so glad you're not there. And, I understand that sentiment, because this is not easy. This is whatever you decide. It's a lose-lose or a win-win, I guess, but I see it as a lose-lose because it's a really tough, it's unprecedented.
Yeah. And one of the things that I guess I'm personally concerned about the case is that there seems to be a heavy reliance on the testimony of Michael Cohen, which, I mean, I appreciate his sort of like redemption tour, and he seems very repentant for all the stuff he's done, but he doesn't seem like the most credible witness that one could choose. So like how much bearing, can that have on the overall case?
You never want to rest a case on a cooperator, and Michael Cohen, is no hero, right? I mean, he had, if you look back at his federal indictment, beyond the Trump stuff, he had his own fraud involving medallions. Goes back to my adage, right? Don't want prosecutors looking in your stuff. And my feeling, and I can never, this is total speculation, disclaimer, but my feeling is if he didn't have all the medallion stuff, I think he might still be Trump's lawyer, right? Because that was the leverage over him, and he didn't want to go to jail for years and years and years. And that might have, forgive my reference, pastor, but that made him come to Jesus, I think, a little bit. So thank you.
You are forgiven.
So to me, you never want to rely just on a cooperator, but to be, to just look at this objectively, they're not. I mean, you can't also in New York, you can't just rely solely on the word of a cooperator. There is a corroboration requirement. By the way, not the same in the federal system. You can literally bring a case just on the word of a cooperator. So, but even if you can, should you? And the answer is no, because of course, for all the reasons that you guys as smart people, but not lawyers, know, right? Why would you listen to this guy? He's, he was on Team Trump, 10 minutes ago. Why are we listening to him now?
Right.
So the reason that I think that we're in stronger territory, and again, I'm reading the same papers and blogs and Twitter feeds that you guys are, so I don't have the inside track, but it does seem that David Pecker from AMI is cooperating. I'm guessing Wesselberg probably might be also here on this because of the change in lawyer, and also because of the references to him in the statement of facts. So there's other witnesses, albeit you could say they're also cooperators, but then there's paper, and at the end of the day, that's what ultimately gets convictions. There are text messages. There are entries in the business records, and the fact is there was no retainer agreement. And whether you love Michael Cohen, loathe him, there's no retainer agreement. These were hush money payments, and when you I think the thing that's wonderful about criminal law, but also can be frustrating, is that there's so much noise, but you have to peel it back to its essence. This is about a series of payments that were made to Stormy Daniels, and if they were just paid out of his own bank account, he'd be fine. But because there is a false entry, and there's multiple false entries and multiple false invoices, we're here today.
Yeah, just for the record, for those that don't know, Alan Weisselberg is the CFO of the Trump organization, and he had his day in court for a while, and I find it interesting that Trump hasn't attacked him, and seems very, I don't know, like he seems like he wants to keep him on his good side, which may or may not mean something.
Time will tell. And he certainly was very loyal to him in the first, there was a trial back in the fall against the Trump organization. And Mr. Weisselberg had pleaded, he ate the indictment. I'll give you guys which means that normally when you plea bargain with someone, even if they had 1,000 counts, you pick the top count, you pick the one you want them to plead to. But they made him plead to every single one of the counts. I forgot how many, 30, something like 34, but maybe it wasn't quite as many. But he ate the indictment. So he was not he was the reluctant cooperator, to be sure. But the change in lawyer and sort of and his sprinkling throughout that statement of facts, I wouldn't be surprised if ultimately he's come to Jesus once again.
That makes a lot of sense. That's very interesting. So this is my last question. between now and December, that's about when the trial will start?
No.
Something along those lines? So now
No,
in
not-
December or no? What would...
December.
So tell me, so between now and whenever it starts, what can happen? Like maybe when do you anticipate it'll start? And then what can happen? What's Trump's next move? What do they do?
Okay,
What do
so
you
in a
think?
normal case, normal white collar case, but even a normal, any case, like, right, if you're indicted, an indictment, I used to describe it as the admission ticket nobody wants, right? It's an admission ticket to the Supreme Court. New York is very weird because the Supreme Court is our trial court level, and every other state smart, this place I can have to knock my home state because it makes no sense. But the lowest court is the Supreme Court. But it's the admission ticket to be prosecuted. And then usually what happens is after the arraignment, they're arraigned just like Trump was. And then it's put off usually for what they call control date, which is just a date to circle back, have a chance to look at the discovery, see if there are any outstanding issues, and in a more normal case, see if the person wants to plead guilty. And if not, right, or if there are no issues, then what happens is it gets put on for a motion schedule. And a motion schedule is the defense attorneys are going to now that they've looked at the discovery, now that they've been given a bill of particulars. Bill of particulars is, again, in Old England. Remember I said in New York is like common law. It literally is, tell us what these charges really are. So that statement of facts that has like every little bit of detail, that no longer stands. You have to pick a theory. So that's something that would happen in that initial period before the control date. But again, here we have this insane, what is it? 9-month adjournment. So this is all happening off calendar. So this is going to happen with the parties, and we, the public, aren't going to be privy to this. But at some point during this period, the bill of particulars will be turned over, and motions. I believe that the motion schedule was set. So in other words, I don't know when it is, but let's just say for argument's sake, the judge said, okay, by June, defense attorneys, you have to file your motions. And the motions are, mainly it's going to be the motion to dismiss, because that grand jury procedure that we went over earlier, that has to be, reviewed by a judge. So it has to make sure that, there was evidence and the charges were right, and that the DA didn't go in there and grandstand and just give their opinions and all sorts of other technical bases. So the judge is going to look at those minutes, make sure that there was reasonable basis, and then they're going to attack it on other grounds. They're going to say selective prosecution. They're going to, but for him being Donald Trump, he would never be prosecuted for that. Maybe they'll move for a change of venue because, Manhattan is the land of liberals. Whatever they want to say, they're going to put that in those motions. And then the prosecution has a opportunity to respond. The motion responds, and the grand jury proceedings are viewed in the light most favorable to the people, the district attorney, because again, it's a very low bar. It's not a trial, so they're going to point to all the they're going to do their own recitation in the motion response, saying here's why this is totally sufficient. And the way I would do it is I would literally link to the transcript. Page 17 says, this is where you saw this and that and whatever, and you just write it all out. So those motions will be litigated, if you will. The judge will have a decision. I believe that the December date is the decision date. So at that time, we will know whether, there's anything, the judge could dismiss certain charges. They could say everything's great. They could rule that it should be a change of venue. They could say they can do lots of things, but the decision date, and that's just important because that will then essentially determine where we go from there. So assuming that, some combination of things, or, everything is copacetic, everything is as it is now. In any event,
okay.
So December is just before January 2024, and that's the presidential election year. So when do you schedule a trial? Do you schedule it before Iowa? Do you schedule it before Super Tuesday? I mean, this is, who knows?
Yeah, that's so a while. So can we have you for just 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
There's a couple more questions that I really want to ask you
Sure.
about. One of which is, John Bolton made a critique about the charges recently. He's no friend of Trump, but he sort of made this connection about, this is sort of a slippery slope, because if if this is a campaign charge, like couldn't anything be, like, choosing which comb to buy or cologne or, what have you. So like, is he accurate in his critique, or is there something else here that, the public should be viewing this through the lens of?
No, I don't think he's accurate. And again, it goes back to everyone is equal under the law. And I think it's incumbent upon the district attorney to make sure that he emphasizes that. And again, I think you give fodder to the John Boltons when you put forth a statement of facts and you're cagey about what the underlying crime is. It's fair to treat Donald Trump as any other criminal defendant, and that includes allowing him to be able to formulate a defense.
Got it. Okay. What can you tell us about the judge in the case? Juan
Merchan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It's a great draw. He's a very understated, very thoughtful judge. He's not a someone who makes the case about himself. I mean, the fact that you're asking me this after how many years of him proceeding under other Trump proceedings tells you what you need to know. He's a good judge.
Got it. And are there issues with, I read in an article today that, the death threats to him and his family have increased, which apparently that's where we are as a culture now. But, I know that Breitbart put out a article, had a picture of his daughter. Don Jr. retweeted it. There were some that were saying, that's intimidation or threats or whatever. Like how does that affect the case, and or does that put Trump in more legal jeopardy?
I mean, unless Trump's doing it himself, he's not in legal jeopardy. Or, of course, if there's evidence that he's directing it. And, that's one of the things, there was a lot of talk about gag orders and things like that. And the reality is, if you're Trump, you have enough supporters, you have enough surrogates who can say whatever you need them to say. And if he's smart, that's what he's going to do. It's completely inappropriate to target the judge or the prosecutor. It's funny because, throughout my career, I dealt with some violent people, some powerful people. People would ask me, friends of mine, are you scared? And I said, no, because mostly people understand. I mean, if something happens to me, the next person, I'm fungible, right? There's another person. So there's really, it's incredibly short-sighted and appalling, frankly, to target a judge or prosecutor, because it's not like the case is going to go away. You're not going to. It's not like there's going to be no judges left. There'll be another one, and maybe that judge will be far more sort of incendiary towards Trump than Juan Merchan, Judge Juan Merchan.
That's interesting. So I guess my last question to you is, where does this case kind of fit among the array of all the other cases that we know about Trump? I mean, there's the Fannie Willis one in Georgia. There's the secret document case of Jack Smith. Heck, even I think today, there's the Jean Carroll case taking place. So where does this one fit? And out of the ones I just mentioned, which one do you suspect, is the most, legally troubling for Trump?
Well, so I think what you can kind of put him on a trajectory, right? This is before, during, and after, right? So this is before the election, right? And so allegedly shenanigans related to getting elected. The Georgia case is sort of, a little bit during, like, hey, I didn't lose, throw the votes my way. And then the Jack Smith is the insurrection and the after, like maintaining power. So, none of them are good, I would say. In some ways, it's also probably, I think that this is probably the least this is the least exciting, and it's certainly the least, incendiary in terms of what the charges are. That's why I think people are seeking all these sort of conspiracy theories. At the end of the day, as I said, it's remarkably boring. It's paper. And it's either a lie or it isn't a lie, but that's what it's about. I'm partial. I don't know enough to really say which one is the strongest. I think, to me, the most compelling, as an American, is the Georgia one, because what I love about the Georgia case is that, as polarized as we all are, right? You had, Republicans who, every fiber in their being, they did not want Joe Biden as president, and yet they stood up to, the free leader of the world. And that's what's compelling to me. That's the case I'm most excited to see how it develops and see the evidence.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Well, thank you, Diana, so much for your insight and your expertise. This has been
thank you so much.
Super informative. I really wanted to, ask you a lot of these questions, and they're based off of just a lot of the stuff we've been hearing on the news and what have you. So I think you did a fantastic job just helping clear that up, and I know it's going to be a benefit to our listeners. So
yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you for your time, your expertise. We may have to have you on again to talk about money and politics.
Yes.
And I guess we'll just leave it there. So thank you to our listeners and viewers, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure. I had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks.